What's going on, fellas? I have a fun little video for you today. Today we're going to talk about strategies that you can use to improve your form. We all kind of know generally good form is important, but it's rare that I see people implementing well thought out strategies to improve their form. Now, first and foremost, good form is relative to the goal. Right? So there is good form for moving the most weight possible within a competition style rule set. Good form could be actually making a lift as hard as possible on a specific musculature to promote hypertrophy in that musculature. So maybe bench pressing for maximizing pec gains is going to be a different good form than bench pressing to maximize a competitive result. And I guess the third kind of category of good form we could look at is when using a lift to carry over to another lift. The form might be a little bit different, right? How you might do an RDL to best target specifically the hamstrings might be a little bit different than how you might do it to do the most weight possible, which also might be a little bit different than how you would execute them to best carry over to your deadlift. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And we have to kind of look at the exercise slot in our program and ask ourselves, is this something that I want to display strength as best I can on? Is this something that's supposed to carry over to something else? Or is this more of a generalized hypertrophy motion? And we should calibrate our goals for our form accordingly. But we're going to talk about some just different strategies that are going to be vital to becoming more technical. Because if, let's say, we are a lifter whose technique is better than we are strong, so we're more technical than we are strong, that's an awesome place to be, because all we have to do at that point is apply periods of difficult volume and a caloric surplus, and then apply periods of intensity, and just go back and forth. If our form is way ahead of us, leagues ahead of us, we have advanced form, and we're an intermediate or beginner lifter, we just bounce between those two things and reap the rewards over and over and over, and it tends to be pretty simple. Most of us are not in this position where we are far more technical than we are strong. Maybe we're stronger than we are technical. I have been that way the most of my lifting career. I would say I developed very good muscular strength, but was not equally technical. And that was one of the limiting factors within my training. Or let's just say we got intermediate strength and intermediate technique. So alongside these periods of volume and caloric surpluses and then periods of intensity and intermixing those two, we also have to be looking to improve our technique alongside training those physical qualities, which is a little tricky, but it's very worthwhile, and it's realistically a huge part of you going from intermediate to advanced or beginner to intermediate. And it's just as important as chasing those physiological adaptations. Now, the first strategy, going to be pretty obvious, but I think that most of you are guilty of not doing this at times, as I am guilty of doing this at times. And that is not taking your warm-ups seriously, right? Every warm-up you do is an opportunity to practice one of the things that you want to be good at, right? Even if we're squatting 10 sets a week, so maybe a little higher than what a lot of people are doing, if we only take our working set seriously, 10 times to practice something in the grand scheme of things is not that many. Any other task, you'd be looking at throwing a shot put far more times than that a week. We'd be looking at jumping rope far more times than that a week, right? So we want to take advantage of any opportunity to practice that we can. So being present, filming your warm-ups, looking for little things you can work on, and treating them like heavy weights is one of the windows that you can suddenly triple the amount of practice, maybe quadruple the amount of practice you get on a given lift. And the amount that you practice tends to correlate with how technical someone is, but that's assuming that it's present and cognizant practice, not just going through the motions. So I would say that's the first one, is try to be really aware during your warm-ups and use those as an opportunity to work on the things that you've identified as an issue with your technique. And also, if you're someone who's relatively weak and you could get to your working weight with a singular warm-up and then jump to working weight and go, maybe take a couple extra warm-ups as some opportunity to refine your motor pattern before you start doing your working sets. So even if you're warm enough to do the set, you want to also prime your technique, and fitting in 1 or 2 extra warm-ups can be an easy way to do so. Max wanted me to mention that just doing bodyweight squats all the time, just to start running up the number of squats you've done in your lifetime, just focusing on whatever it is you feel you need to do better, is a good way to kind of grease the groove and refine that motor pattern. Now, the next one we wanted to talk about was it's a more conceptual one, and that's probably master generally textbook technique before you start diverging into things you feel might be unique to you. Matt Venna made an interesting video the other day where at the end he kind of mentioned that far more people think that they are outliers or that they need something unique within their training or within their technique than could possibly make sense. The majority of people are going to fall somewhere in the center of that bell curve in terms of what is optimal training or what their response to a given stimulus is going to be, right? So the fact that everybody claims they don't respond to volume mathematically doesn't seem to make sense, right? And similarly, I think that plenty of people are going to find their technique, not just generally good squat technique, but they're going to find what works best for them and lean into that. But I think that beginner and intermediate lifters will often misdiagnose something that's a short-term strategy to put more weight on the bar with what their individual refined technique is. So examples of this, I generally recommend you learn how to pull with a relatively neutral-ish back. And then maybe once we can do that reliably up to a reasonably high percentage, maybe then we can start trying to master that rounded thoracic position. But I would first learn that more technique, like textbook style of lift before we start convincing ourselves that this is optimal for me. Everybody else squats low bar, but I do high bar, right? Maybe we should try to learn it first and then deviate from there, just as a general principle, because I do think it's very common for lifters to misdiagnose something that they think is uniquely effective for them just due to their own biases within their training. So that was just more of like a general one to touch on. The next one to touch on is don't just copy your favorite lifter, right? I've talked in the past about how we can select a good technical model of someone who has similar limb lengths to us, somebody who has similar relative strengths and weaknesses to us, people who lean into different aspects of technique. And like I mentioned earlier, maybe we want to learn something a little bit more standardized, kind of what you'd expect, kind of a generic looking squat, bench, deadlift before we start copying these people who have leaned into specific strategies, like maybe a wider stance. Maybe they do squat in a slightly more flexed thoracic position, right? They're leaning into these different strategies to take advantage of their morphology and their individual strengths. And we could, down the line, select people that are well-selected technical models that we can learn from. But just because someone's your favorite lifter or they've got your favorite looking lift does not mean they're a good technical model for you. The age-old story on YouTube is everybody trying to squat like Clarence, when for them Clarence is a horrible technical model and they're just going to get hurt, right? Or everybody wishing they could squat like Lu Xiaojun or Toshiki and have this perfect upright squat. But if you don't have the limb length and the anthropometry for that, as far as like how your hip socket is, that's not going to happen and that's going to lead you astray. So don't just try to copy your favorite lifter. Looking to lifters better than you for inspiration in terms of technique is not a bad idea in itself, but they should be well selected and not just your favorite or the prettiest in your mind. The next one that we're going to talk about is just going out of your way to watch a lot of tutorials on YouTube. And the reason for this is there's some basic principles like we talked about. There's a general technique and it doesn't need to look the exact same for everybody. My squat, no matter what, is going to look different than your squat if you have long femurs because I have short femurs. But there's basic tenets of technique that we're trying to maintain. Probably the toes are not exactly straightforward. They're not a mile out. They're somewhere in between. We're probably focusing on keeping our weight in the dead center of our foot. So even pressure in our forefoot and our heel. We're looking to get our knees tracking forward a bit. We're looking to hinge at the hips a bit. We're looking to drive the knees out a bit. And the ratios between those three things can vary from person to person. We're looking to not be an extension or not be an excessive flexion, somewhere in that generally defined neutral range, create back tightness with a grip that's appropriate for us. So we try to hit these general criteria. But the core thing is to hit these criteria. There's going to be many different phrasings of cues, right? And lots of these cues are going to be trying to do the same thing. They're not all that at odds with one another. One person might say, spread the floor with your feet. Another person might say, knees out. Another person might say, twist your feet into the floor. Another person might say something totally different, right? All of these cues are kind of working in the same general direction to get the same physical thing to happen, but lots of them don't necessarily make sense to a person. And eventually you'll hear one that clicks. It's not that that cue is that much better, it's you found the one that made sense to you. So watching a bunch of tutorials, even if you feel you're above that, you're like, oh, I'm an intermediate lifter, I don't need these how to do a deadlift tutorials, but you might hear something that was missing from your deadlift in a phrasing that really makes it start to make sense, right? For the longest time, I always heard like, oh, tuck your scaps into your back pockets, or tuck your lats into your back pockets, or people who would use a more protracted position would say, okay, I'm tucking my lats into my front pockets. And I was like, what is all this shit about pockets? This doesn't make any sense to me. And at one point, I think I heard somebody say, hey, just do the opposite of a shrug as hard as you can. And I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. You go up for a shrug, you go down for not a shrug. And suddenly I was able to pack my lats way more than I was able to in the past. And since then, okay, I guess where I'm putting the lats kind of makes sense. You could go to the back pocket, you could go to the front pocket. But listening to all of these phrasings, don't feel like you're above that, because you might hear something for creating back tightness in the squat. It's a way of thinking about it that you've never heard before. Some people actively cue pushing up into the bar. Some people cue pulling the bar over your back as if you were trying to bend it, and trying all of these different cues until you find the one that clicks and pushes you towards these general good habits for squatting. The next one is to have a list of cues typed out on your phone or in your head that you run through prior to a lift. And that way we know when we're warming up and we're taking our warm-up seriously and we're filming them and we're looking at them, we can look at our list of cues and we can figure out which of them we're doing a bad job with today, and that can be our focus for the day. So having an actual list, not just vague concepts, and we can write down those phrasings that made the most sense to you, and that can give you on a given day what you're going to be focusing on to get your technique better from your first warm-up to the time you're actually doing your working sets. And also, if you have a chronic issue in your lift or a perceived issue within your lift, you probably should add something to that cue list that's directly addressing it. Because if you have an issue and you don't have a cue that you feel is directly addressing it, chances are you're not going to move towards fixing it. So maybe watch some videos, find a cue that makes the most sense, put that in your physical list of cues, and that's something you can fiddle with time to try to move your technique in the direction that you want to. The next part of this kind of same thing is we also want to have a standardized setup, right? Because most of us are not very good at thinking while we lift. We want to put a lot of effort, we want to front load our effort. The more effort we put into our setup and getting into perfect positions before the lift, the less thinking we have to do during the lift, and the easier the lift is going to be. If you put a ridiculous amount of effort into getting tight before you deadlift, the deadlift itself is going to feel relatively easy, even if it's relatively heavy. And that's a lot better than putting minimal effort beforehand and the lift itself feeling hard as hell. Same principle applies to a bench press. We want to get as tight as we can, put all this effort into before the unrack, and we'll make the lift itself comparatively easier. And we want to have a list we run through of like, okay, feet, and then I'm going to set my brace, I'm going to grab the bar, pull into position, go. Right? And much like the cues, we want to have this physical list, because if we have an issue in our technique, one of the easiest things we can do is make small alterations to our setup that might change that, because it is very difficult to think while you're straining. Whereas a change to your setup could potentially get rid of it without having to think while you're straining. You just put yourself in a position for success where you're like, okay, well, I created tension in this muscle before I started the lift. I just have to maintain it. That's a lot easier than thinking, okay, I have to create tension in this muscle while I do the lift, right? So that's, for me, as someone who's not great at thinking while I lift, that's the majority of the way I make a lot of my technical changes. Is if there's something I want to see myself do differently, usually that's going to manifest as me fiddling with my cues or my ordering or adding in a new cue to my setup list. And that's pretty quickly going to reflect in my technique. The next one we're going to talk about is have a technical focus coming into the session. If you know that you have an error in this part of the lift, or a perceived error that's hurting your result, or maybe it's making it less stimulative for the muscle you want it to be, or maybe it's carrying over worse, come into the session having thought to yourself, okay, today my focus is going to be keeping that pressure in my feet. even front to back. That's going to be the thing. And you can diagnose what you want to work on the way up, or you can come in and know habitually this is my issue. You should know coming in that this is an objective of training. So even if you didn't hit the numbers you wanted, if you put in good work to remedy that issue, that's one level in which you succeeded. We came into that session with 2 goals. Maybe it was to hit some good sets of 8 in a hypertrophy phase, and also to work on this front to back balance thing. And the ultimate victory for that session would be to do both. I put in some good sets of 8, and I felt like I paid really good attention to correcting that mistake I was making with where my weight is in my feet. So coming in with a technical focus for each of those lifts can go a long way. Set that goal ahead of time. Think about it ahead of time. Reflect on it afterward. Set a goal for next time in terms of refining your technique. Just like how we might reflect and set goals for the weights on the bar or the volume, we also might want to reflect and set goals for the technique that we're using. The next one, I think I've already touched on this, is to film your sets and watch between. You can look at that, look at your list of cues, and get a good feel for which of your cues that you're kind of botching today, and that opens up this window to fix it by the time the weights get heavy. And that's a lot of the reason that training sessions for Max or myself end up taking quite a while, is because we want to make sure we are in good spec by the time we're doing the working sets. Because when you get stronger, any one set tends to be a little bit more stimulative, right? So let's say a triple at 90% for a lifter that squats 200 pounds tends to have different physiological implications than someone who squats 750 pounds. There's just a tax there that isn't necessarily the same, even though the relative intensity is the same. So maybe Max doesn't have to do as many squat sets as he used to when he was weaker, but because he does not have that many sets to do, we need to make sure they're quality. So he'll film each of his warm-ups after a certain weight, look at his cues, try to figure out what he's doing wrong, and try to fix that before he gets to the working weight. And some days he's not doing anything wrong. You just put some weight on, put some weight on, put some weight on, go. And some days it's a trial and error of maybe repeat this weight once or twice, then go up, then fix something else. And that way we're functioning as well as we can. It's not always going to be perfect. We might be coming in fatigued or under recovered, but make it the best we can by the time we're doing those limited number of work sets. And that's something I think that anybody could implement. Now, the last two I think are strategies that I lean into myself as someone who's not great at thinking while I strain. I've always been a very explosive person. Back in the day when I was boxing is very reflexive, right? You drill all of these patterns and reflexes within your training, and then when you're sparring, you're not thinking, oh, he's throwing a left hook, I'm going to duck. You drilled it, so you're just following what your subconscious does. And that's how I learned to exercise. And that did not result very well for lifting, where I basically didn't think while I lifted, and my technique developed a lot slower than my strength. And I think it did slow my rate of progression. And that's a skill that I've never quite caught up to. I'm not great at thinking while I move. Still something I'm working on, but some strategies that I have used as someone who's not great at thinking about my technique while I lift to improve my technique. The biggest one is using variations that reward the motor pattern you want and punish the motor pattern you don't. Something like a front squat. If you pitch forward, the bar physically falls. It's the ultimate, it punishes this motor pattern. But something like a pause in the hold. If you notice that you tend to crash into the bottom of the squat, lose your tension, and then kind of collapse as you stand up. Something like a pause, something like a tempo, something like altering the bar position, using an SSB, using a front squat, tempo bench press, long pause bench press, Spoto press. Yes, they're all good muscular stimulus. They're gonna place a little bit more emphasis on the hips or on the chest or on the triceps, but they also can be used to repattern your main movement by punishing certain bad habits that you might have. And your subconscious is going to learn very quickly, oh, when I keep my back tight, this doesn't feel like shit. And then you're gonna start keeping your back tight. So for those of us that are dumb, I think this can be a very easy strategy to lean into if we select those exercises well to highlight the technical qualities that we want. If someone has a horrible habit of always yanking their deadlift off the ground like I do, having them pause as low off the floor as physically possible is a way to reward the motor patterns we are looking for. And that's been one of the biggest ways I've made my technical gains, is just doing a good job selecting what exercises I use as my variations, to not just be, oh, it builds this muscle, but to say, oh, it builds this motor pattern. And then the final one that I wanted to talk about as far as strategies that I myself has leaned into is doing lifts more often and in a fatigued state. So generally speaking, I've always said, if I offered you $1 million to get great at jumping rope, you wouldn't jump rope once a week. Right? Lifting weights is a little bit different because deadlifting is a lot more taxing physically than jumping rope is. So there's inherent limitations to frequency depending on how taxing the task is, right? If you were trying to get really good at jump roping, you might jump rope for 3 sessions a day because you're able to recover from it, and it's going to allow you to accrue skill at a greater rate. There's a limit to any given lift if we're training it in a serious manner. Technical sessions can be a way to run up frequency without this, but if we're training it in a serious manner, there are limitations to how many productive sessions we can get in per week. But we should look for the upper end of that. And one of the biggest misunderstandings I see is people say, oh, my body can't recover from 2 deadlift sessions per week, it can only do 1.5. Well, you could train it to. Your body adapts to the imposed stimulus, and you can acclimate to a whole variety of different workloads over time as long as you ease into it. So the question is, okay, well, should you train your body to acclimate to deadlifting twice a week? And a lot of the time the answer is yes, because it's like in the moment, yeah, 2 isn't ideal, 2 hard sessions. But if we take the time to train our like muscle specific recovery capacity and make our motor patterns more efficient, suddenly we could do 2 and we'll probably benefit from it. So frequency is something that in the moment there's an ideal, but there also might be something that we want to strive towards in the future as an alternate ideal. And that kind of brings me to what I was going to say, which is if you want to get better at something, doing it more often is one of the easiest ways to do them. If you can't recover from it, using technical sessions is a wonderful option. And also, doing a lift under fatigue isn't the most dangerous thing in the world. Your body has this cool little neat built-in system where it's going to limit your ability to output force if you're fatigued. So it's almost auto-regulating for your safety on your behalf. So yeah, on our secondary deadlift day, we might lift a little bit less weight, but that's also kind of what's keeping us safe. And the fact that we're coming into that session a little bit fatigued is going to make you do a hell of a lot better job being mechanically efficient. And this is something that I've learned recently, leaning into some high frequency training as a bit of an experiment, is when I come into every deadlift session fresh, my lower back feels good, I feel powerful, I can just muscle up the weight until it gets up to 90-95%. I can get away with bad motor patterns because I'm fresh, I'm feeling powerful, and I can just manhandle the weight up. When I'm fatigued, that's not as much of an option. I have to, if I want to get the session done, I have to lean into being mechanically efficient, keeping that weight in close, getting a nice start position, make sure I use a good brace to try to decrease the demands on my low back, which is already a little bit sore. And that's been a big way to force some technical adaptations. I've used this in the bench press in the past, which is when I'm fresh, I can just rocket rep up to like probably about 475 off my chest and put no effort into my form. As long as I get tight and put a lot of effort into it, I don't necessarily get punished for bad technique until it gets really heavy. But if I'm fatigued, suddenly I'm getting punished for bad technique at 400, at 365, and that forced me to develop my technique a lot faster. So training under fatigue, yes, we have to be careful. Yes, we have to be smart, but it can be a tool to use to force yourself to make some technical improvement. So that would be all the ones I wanted to touch on. Thank you guys for watching my video. I appreciate you boys.